Welcome to the mini book podcast, African American Books Edition. Today we are discussing compelling excerpts from the book The Black Agenda by Glenn Ford and Margaret Kimberly. We thank you for listening, and please consider subscribing for future content. The voices you hear come from AI, but the content is drawn straight from the book, which we feel is a great way to learn about African American history. After hearing this podcast, we would encourage you to go out and purchase this book and support the authors. Okay, so let's get into this. This is really an incredible body of work. Our mission today is to navigate the rigorous and, unapologetically leftist and Black liberationist journalism of Glenn Ford.
Right, especially as it's presented with Margaret Kimberly in this book.
Exactly. We're going to be looking at a powerful critique of American politics, its history, the media, and really the way power functions.
And for you, the listener, it offers a kind of blueprint for skepticism and critical thinking, all based directly on the source material.
A blueprint is a great way to put it.
It really is. The book provides this deep, very complex analysis of several overlapping crises, things that really define modern American life.
So where do we start?
Well, we'll be looking at the structure of the two-party system, what Ford so brilliantly called the political duopoly.
The duopoly, right.
And we'll also examine the systematic and often, orchestrated destruction of Black political power in major cities. A process. The authors, well, they don't mince words. They call it Negro removal.
That's a powerful term.
It is. And crucially, we'll also analyze the role of certain Black leaders in, according to the book, actively enabling these corporate agendas.
To do that, we'll need to break down some key terms, right?
Absolutely. We'll provide clear context for complex terminology like the Black misleadership class and the foundational concept of racial capitalism.
And this is where the perspective of the book becomes so vital for understanding our current moment. I mean, Ford and Kimberly argue that truly critical independent journalism is, quote, irreplaceable.
It really is the core of their argument.
Their insights span decades, from exposing figures like Cory Booker's early political ties to right-wing organizations, to analyzing the devastating aftermath of Hurricane Katrina.
And even looking at the profound racial disparities during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right. Their work offers this highly relevant and often very uncomfortable lens for understanding the systemic forces that shape our information environment and political reality today.
It really forces you to ask a fundamental question.
Which is,
whose interests are being served by the official narrative? So to really appreciate the sharpness of Ford's analysis, we first need to understand his background, his deep roots in the Black left.
He wasn't just reporting on this from the outside.
Not at all. Glenn Rutherford, born in 1949, actually described himself as a red diaper baby.
Okay, let's break that term down for a minute. What does that mean?
It means his parents were politically radical, often communist or socialist, and he was raised in an environment where, leftist struggle and activism were just part of the family legacy.
So that set him on a path that was pretty distinct from mainstream Black politics right from the start.
From the very beginning.
And that foundation, that political commitment, it wasn't just abstract, was it? The sources point to this incredibly potent story from his childhood.
They do. It's quite telling. His parents attended the famous Paul Robeson and Pete Seeger concert in Peekskill, New York in September 1949.
Right, the concert that was attacked.
Exactly. This concert was organized to raise money for civil rights defense and was attacked by a violent, organized right-wing mob.
Just for being there, for their association with leftist causes.
Yes. So imagine growing up with that kind of historical touchstone, a direct physical confrontation between the progressive left and the organized right.
It must have shaped his entire worldview.
It solidified a worldview where political struggle was dangerous, but also necessary and generational.
And you combine that legacy with his experiences growing up in the segregated South, and you have someone uniquely positioned to critique American power structures.
Without a doubt.
His entry into broadcast news was also pretty extraordinary. He was reading Newswire copy on his father's radio show in Columbus, Georgia.
At age 11.
11. That's incredible.
It is. And his early career was really defined by this mission to put broadcast media at the service of the people, not just, for entertainment or passive news.
And in 1970, he began his professional career working at a very famous radio station.
James Brown's radio station, WRDW-AM, in Augusta, Georgia. And the sources note that it was the godfather of soul himself, James Brown, who affectionately shortened his name to Ford.
I love that detail. But it's the political action they took at that station that really speaks to his mission. What did it actually mean, putting radio at the service of the people in segregated Georgia in the early
It
70s.
meant getting directly involved in the local struggle. Ford and his colleagues at WRDW used the platform to empower grassroots activists.
So they weren't just reporting on events.
No, they were amplifying voices that the mainstream media completely ignored. This activism was directly credited with challenging the entrenched white power structure in the region.
And the book says these efforts culminated in a period of intense struggle, a Black rebellion in Columbus.
That's right, described as the nation's longest sustained urban rebellion on record. So Ford witnessed and participated in media being a genuine force for, revolutionary anti-racist transformation.
And this path leads us to the heart of his identity, which the authors define using a historical term, the race man. This might sound a little archaic to modern listeners, but Ford is described as the penultimate race man.
We should probably break down what that means in his context.
Let's do that.
The term race man emerged during the era of segregation and disenfranchisement. It described a black male intellectual or leader whose primary, often singular dedication was to meeting the needs of black people and fighting the mechanisms of their oppression.
So for Ford, it wasn't just one issue among many.
No, his analysis was uncompromisingly centered on it. He rejected what he saw as these comforting bourgeois narratives of bootstraps or respectability politics.
Respectability politics. That's a key distinction. What did Ford mean when he rejected that whole approach?
Well, respectability politics, in this context, suggests that black communities can overcome systemic racism by just adopting behaviors and norms that are deemed acceptable by the white middle class.
The pull yourself up by your bootstraps argument.
Exactly. Ford saw this as a complete diversion, an attempt to blame the victims for structural problems. His Marxist framework demanded that the analysis focus squarely on the systemic history of anti-black racism.
Not on individual moral failings.
Precisely. The history of dispossession and institutional violence. And this perspective was global, too, linking domestic anti-black racism to international imperialism.
So his political ideology wasn't flexible. He was staunchly a Marxist. This wasn't just a political affiliation for him. It was the lens through which he analyzed everything.
Right, and that separated him from many mainstream black political writers who would often identify as liberal Democrats or progressives.
And that Marxist, black liberationist ideology provided the intellectual armor, you could say, to resist co-optation.
That's a good way to put it. It defined his concept of journalism itself. For him, it had to be more than just accurate, well-sourced information.
It had to have a purpose.
A clear purpose. It had to be advocacy for the marginalized and rigorous, unflinching exposure of the privileged. His commitment wasn't to neutrality in the classical media sense, but to the truth as viewed from the perspective of the oppressed.
That leads us right to the function of his platforms, Black Commentator and later Black Agenda Report. They weren't just providing news, they were offering what he called alternative news.
Information that Ford argued was actively disappeared by media outlets and personalities who collude with corporate interests and with the state.
And how did he see that collusion play out?
He saw it in the history of black media itself. Ford was active during what he called the golden age of black radio news in the 60s and 70s.
Which emerged because black audiences were demanding relevant local political content.
Exactly. But he watched its systematic destruction. When corporate consolidation accelerated, driven by asset inflation, local radio stations just stopped being community institutions.
They became just another asset on a balance sheet.
Right. Chain managers replaced local owners, and they prioritized profit above everything else.
And the government basically helped this happen, right? The sources mentioned the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, played a key role.
A huge role. The FCC drastically narrowed the legal definition of what constituted the public interest.
How so?
By making local and national news coverage optional rather than mandatory for license renewal, they essentially gave corporate owners permission to slash news budgets to the bone.
Which just decimated the entire ecosystem of independent, politically active black radio news.
It left a vacuum for the corporate media narratives to rush in and fill.
Yet, despite this systemic decline, Ford actively created his own mechanism to shape the national conversation, America's Black Forum, ABF. This was a hugely ambitious project for its time.
It was absolutely pioneering. Ford developed and hosted ADF, which debuted in January 1977.
The exact same week as the TV miniseries Roots.
Yes, placing it squarely at a moment of cultural reawakening around black history. The core mission was to fill this massive void, nationally syndicated black news interviews on commercial television.
Before ABF, there was really no black counterpart to shows like Meet the Press.
None. Those shows dictated the national news cycle every Monday morning based on their Sunday interviews, and there was no black voice at that table.
And for a while, it was a spectacular success.
For 4 years, ABF generated national and international headlines almost weekly. The book notes it was so effective that it even beat ABC's Issues and Answers in the ratings at ABC's own Washington affiliate.
It was a journalistic powerhouse.
It really was. It demonstrated that the demand for serious, high-level black political analysis was there.
But the story of ABF ends on a bitter note, one that sort of foreshadows Ford's later focus on corporate corruption.
It serves as a perfect early parable. Ford and his co-producer were forced to sell a majority interest to a black investors group to cover debts.
And Ford later left the program entirely.
He did, fighting what he called crooked investors, who reneged on promises to assume debt. He noted that even though the show continued for another 25 years, it very seldom made news again after he left.
So what was the lesson he took from that?
It taught him a crucial lesson. The struggle for independent black media is always a constant, high-stakes battle against corrupt corporate and political forces.
Even when those forces wear black faces.
Exactly. And this lesson directly informed his later and fiercest critiques.
That struggle against corporate influence really sets the stage for our next section, where Ford tackles the core structure of American political power. We have to start by defining what the book calls the political duopoly.
Right. The term political duopoly refers to the Republican and Democratic parties. Ford's analysis posits that these two parties function not as ideological opposites,
Which is how they're always presented.
always, but instead as two wings of the same system. They provide the political theater, the constant fighting, the performative differences, but ultimately they perform the identical core work of the ruling classes.
Serving the financial interests of capital above all else.
That's the argument.
And the most provocative, maybe the most famous conclusion Ford drew about this duopoly centered on the Obama administration.
Yes.
He argued that Obama and the Democrats were not the lesser evil, but rather the more effective evil. That is a brutal summation. What did he mean by more effective?
The effectiveness lies in their ability to achieve ruling class objectives while neutralizing the typical sources of popular resistance.
Okay, unpack that.
An openly conservative Republican administration might struggle to enact austerity or launch new foreign wars because the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the black community would mobilize against them.
Sure, that makes sense.
But when a Democrat, especially the first black president, carries out the agenda of the wealthy, corporations, and the military-industrial complex,
The opposition quiets down.
the left and the black community often silence themselves in deference and perceived solidarity. The Democrats, in this view, become the ideal vehicle for austerity and imperialism because their identity provides political cover.
So Obama's ascendancy was seen as a dangerous culmination of this.
Exactly. The moment when, as Ford put it, Goldman Sachs and the anti-war movement were on the same page.
Meaning corporate interests were safe, and the traditional forces of opposition were temporarily neutralized by the symbolism of the Obama presidency.
Precisely.
This analysis requires us to introduce another complex term, one that's central to Ford and Kimberly's work, the Black Misleadership class.
Yes, the BMLC. It's a critical concept in the book.
So what is it?
The Black Misleadership class, or BMLC, is described as emerging primarily after the victories of the 1960s civil rights movement. Instead of continuing the radical tradition of King or Malcolm X, this class became eager to join the corporate and Democratic Party ranks.
Their priorities shifted.
Completely. They prioritized personal upward mobility, status, and proximity to power, and they actively dreaded genuine social or economic transformation that might upset the existing order.
So if the black masses are overwhelmingly working class and left-leaning, the BMLC acts as their opposite. How do they function as firemen, as the book calls them, for the mass black incarceration state?
They function as necessary interlocutors. They are the professional political faces of the community who are relied upon by the ruling structures to manage discontent and steer activists toward incremental, harmless reforms.
Instead of systemic change.
Exactly. They protect the Democratic Party and the system from popular unrest. Ford compared them directly and unflinchingly to the House Negroes figure used by Malcolm X, those who identify their welfare completely with the masters, fearing any true disruption to the plantation system.
And Ford was never shy about naming names to illustrate this phenomenon. The sources focus heavily on the rise of Cory Booker as the perfect case study.
Ford's reporting here was really groundbreaking. He was the first journalist to systematically expose Booker's astonishing ascent.
This was during his first campaign for mayor of Newark.
That's right. Ford demonstrated that Booker wasn't some organic community leader, but a project of wealthy, right-wing interests. He revealed Booker's deep financial and intellectual ties to organizations like the Manhattan Institute and the Bradley Foundation.
For those who aren't familiar, what's the significance of those two organizations in this context?
They are powerful conservative think tanks and foundations. They're known for promoting free market principles, austerity, and privatization.
Especially targeting public services like schools.
Schools, municipal assets, you name it. Ford showed that Booker was being groomed to champion this specific agenda: austerity, privatization, and an end to public union power, all dressed up in the cloak of progressive black political leadership.
And this reporting had a real impact.
It did. The exposure was so effective that Booker's opponent distributed Ford's articles during the campaign, which really demonstrates the power of independent journalism to disrupt a carefully crafted narrative.
Speaking of allegiance,
Right.
the book argues that nowhere was this corruption of the black political tradition more evident than during the Obama presidency.
Absolutely.
Ford consistently maintained an independent, critical stance, seeing Obama and Hillary Clinton as fundamentally political twins who are offering the same failed corporate militarist policies.
The book argues that Obama's presidency had this profoundly corrosive effect on the historical black political consensus.
How so?
Historically, black people were the most reliably left-leaning demographic in the country. They consistently showed the least support for wars and foreign interventions.
But that changed under Obama.
It did. The mandate to protect the first black president, to showcase racial solidarity, transformed this cohort into what Ford called cheerleaders for U.S. foreign aggression. This required them to sacrifice their long-held, radical anti-imperialist principles.
And the sources provide a really stunning data point to quantify this exact shift in the Congressional Black Caucus, the CBC, regarding votes for war.
The numbers are incredibly stark.
Let's hear them.
In 2002, when George W. Bush sought authorization to invade Iraq, a highly controversial Republican war, only 4 members of the CBC voted to authorize that invasion.
Just 4. Okay.
Now, fast forward to 2011, when President Obama called for support for the U.S. NATO bombing of Libya. Suddenly, the dynamic shifted entirely.
What was the vote then?
More than half the caucus, 24 CBC members, voted to support what Ford explicitly labeled a war crime.
From 4 votes to 24 votes in favor of a war of aggression. That pivot. It shows the political cost of the BMLC's allegiance to the Democratic Party structure.
It reveals everything. It shows how the BMLC prioritized protecting the Democratic man in the White House over the historical black consensus against imperialism.
So what was Ford's conclusion about Obama's ultimate legacy?
That he was a corporate militarist who shielded bankers after the 2008 financial crisis, relentlessly pursued austerity, and sought cuts to entitlements. He was, in Ford's view, a political soulmate of Herbert Hoover in his deference to capital while avoiding necessary societal conflicts. For the ruling class, he was the ultimate embodiment of the more effective evil.
If the black misleadership class was serving capital on the national stage, we now have to look at how that translated into crises for black citizens in America's cities. Let's turn to Hurricane Katrina in 2005, which the authors call the clarifying catastrophe.
Katrina was pivotal because it just stripped away the veneer of governance. It exposed what Ford termed the diabolical intentions of U.S. rulers towards African Americans.
The failure to rescue and the political decisions that followed?
Made it clear that the goal was the methodical removal of concentrated black populations from valuable central cities, using the disaster as a convenient, sudden mechanism.
What were the economic intentions behind this Negro removal, as they call it? What was the specific plan for the new New Orleans?
Well, post-Katrina, corporate and municipal planners openly developed reconstruction plans that projected a future black population of no more than 30%.
30%. That's specific.
That's specific. It was considered the maximum tolerable proportion necessary for a stable and positive business environment.
So the goal was to ensure the city's renaissance, which really just meant land value inflation and tourist-driven capital investment, could proceed without the political impediments of a majority poor black electorate demanding social services and justice.
That was the calculus.
This moment was, according to the sources, the greatest test of black leadership since Reconstruction. And the Congressional Black Caucus?
Failed spectacularly.
Why? What happened?
Their failure was heartbreakingly political. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, looking ahead to the 2006 congressional elections, issued an edict to the CDC: boycott the Republican-led Katrina hearings.
An edict to boycott the hearings.
Yes. The unspoken political calculus was that the Democrats needed to distance themselves from issues deemed too black, too strong, that might alienate centrist voters.
That's an astonishing phrase, too black, too strong.
It is. And in a stunning display of party loyalty overriding constituent needs, 41 of the 42 black members of Congress obeyed Pelosi's order.
41 members.
They prioritized the Democratic Party's electoral success over the immediate rescue and political defense of black New Orleans.
So only one member, Cynthia McKinney, defied the directive and participated. The sources argue that this age of Katrina, not the age of Obama, is what fundamentally illuminates the racism coiled deep within ruling structures.
That is the core takeaway. Katrina demonstrated that the system is primed to aggressively activate Negro removal in an instant to clear black concentrations from places of economic value.
And this acute disaster then transitioned into a more chronic crisis.
A slow-acting crisis of gentrification and austerity. To understand this chronic process, we have to define austerity not just as budget cuts, but as a racialized political order.
How does austerity function specifically as a racialized political order in America?
It means that concentrated black populations are systematically denied the fundamental democratic rights and legal capacity necessary to protect their collective and individual property from the finance capitalist class.
It's a mechanism of political disenfranchisement designed to facilitate economic plunder.
Exactly. And Detroit is presented as the absolute nexus of this new American apartheid.
Okay, let's detail the Detroit crisis. Ford's reporting directly challenged the mainstream narrative, which was all about blaming bad governance by black city leaders.
Right, that was the easy story. But Ford argued that Detroit was pushed to financial ruin not by mismanagement, but by exploitative derivative schemes engineered by the very banks that then claimed the right to liquidate the city's assets.
So when the city fell into crisis,
Republican lawmakers, ignoring a popular state referendum opposing such measures, implemented emergency financial management laws.
and this led to the appointment of the emergency financial manager, Kevin Orr. What power did he have, and what was the immediate result for the overwhelmingly black populace?
Orr was effectively an unelected dictatorial ruler. He usurped the powers of the city's elected officials, the mayor, the city council, the school board,
Answering only to the ruling class.
and the powerful financial institutions he was previously affiliated with. His rule resulted in the political disenfranchisement of over half the state's black population, as most majority black cities and school districts were placed under similar governance.
This political disenfranchisement then enabled these brutal, targeted austerity measures. What specific, coercive examples of austerity were used against Detroit residents?
The austerity was calculated to inflict maximum pain and expedite the exodus, or threatened huge pension cuts, initially 26%.
26%.
He eventually settled for a 4.5% cut, alongside the elimination of cost of living increases, which coerced elderly residents into accepting a deal that diminished their security. But perhaps the most devastating, deliberate tactic was the mass punishment of water cutoffs.
The sources dedicate significant attention to the water cutoffs as a weapon of what they call ethnic cleansing.
They describe it as being analogous to ancient siege tactics, where armies deprive towns of water to force surrender. The Detroit Water and Sewage Department cut off water service to tens of thousands of residents, almost exclusively African American.
This was a direct tactic to make life so intolerable that people would be forced to abandon their homes.
And leave the city. A class action suit filed by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund argued that this was racially motivated, noting that the victims were nearly 100% African American, while the private companies hired to enforce the cuts were basically Caucasian companies.
So Detroit became ground zero for understanding how racial capitalism uses state-sanctioned financial crisis to enact targeted urban removal.
It's the textbook case.
Given that black politicians, according to the book, squandered the historical opportunity of chocolate cities by bending over backward for corporate investment, what alternative did the authors prescribe for resistance?
The argument is that black political forces lacked an independent urban plan. They just tried to attract corporate investment on any terms, which led to predictable exploitation.
So what's the solution?
An urban movement, rooted in mass mobilization, a powerful, organized effort to actively disrupt and supersede corporate development schemes.
It requires taking the initiative away from the corporation.
Exactly. Taking it away from corporations who currently hold all the urban planning data and leverage, and formulating democratic, community-driven development plans that prioritize the existing working-class population.
Before I move on, let's finalize the complex terminology here by defining gentrification within this framework of racialized austerity.
It's important to be precise here. Ford and Kimberly define gentrification not as some organic growth.
Not as just neighborhoods improving.
No. But as a methodical corporate penetration and a planned process that requires intimate government collaboration, everything from zoning changes to police enforcement.
And the goal?
It is designed to inflate land assets through ethnic cleansing, resulting in a slow but tortuous African-American exodus. It is, in essence, a long-term, slow-acting, intentional process of Negro removal.
Succeeding where Katrina operated in an instant.
Precisely.
Ford's skepticism of the American narrative extends deep into the country's founding myths, and his analysis of Thanksgiving is probably his most aggressive piece of historical revisionism.
It is an uncompromising analysis, for sure.
He calls it the supremely white American holiday.
And the most ghoulish event on the national calendar. For Ford, it functions as a pure glorification of racist barbarity.
The book argues that to understand the U.S. state, we have to acknowledge its seminal crimes.
Act 1, the genocidal European project against indigenous people, and Act 2, African slavery.
And the Thanksgiving myth
is defined as a national consecration of the unspeakable, a mythic story that serves to validate everything that followed by acting as a moral balm for the victors.
Let's delve into the specific and horrifying colonial chronicles the sources cite to dismantle the traditional narrative of the peaceful 1621 feast.
The historical detail is crucial. The Pilgrims didn't land in some untouched wilderness in 1620. They landed in a Wampanoag virtual cemetery.
A virtual cemetery.
The local population had already been devastated by smallpox, likely planted during English raids or encounters. John Winthrop, the future governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, was recorded as thanking God for this plague, saying it had cleared our title to this place.
Wow.
Yeah. Ford notes that even the ambiguity around the 1621 feast, whether Chief Massasoit was actually invited to bring the 90 Indians who dined with the 52 colonists, it all just underscores the fragility of that peace.
But the authentic Thanksgiving, the one officially proclaimed by the colonial leadership, occurred 16 years later in a context of mass murder.
That's the real historical weight of the argument. The genuine Thanksgiving Day was proclaimed by Governor John Winthrop after the 1637 Mystic Massacre.
The Mystic Massacre.
In that horrific event, English and Allied forces attacked a fortified Pequot village, slaughtering approximately 700 non-combatants, men, women, and children.
700 people.
And Governor William Bradford, the same chronicler of the 1621 feast, described the gruesome sight of them frying in the fire as a sweet sacrifice.
A sweet sacrifice. That's chilling.
It is. Winthrop proclaimed that day a formal celebration for subduing the Pequots.
And the authors connect this founding violence directly to the enduring culture of American exceptionalism through one final chilling anecdote.
They do. The legacy of violence was taught to children as a lesson in divine favor. 55 years after the original feast, the Wampanoag chief King Philip, or Metacomet, was killed during King Philip's War.
And after his death.
His head was severed and stuck on a pole in Plymouth, where the skull remained on display for 24 years, right in the heart of the settlement.
For 24 years.
Teaching settler children that God loved them best of all.
Yeah.
This is how the authors demonstrate that the nation's mythology is cemented in racist barbarity.
Moving from foundational history to modern imperial violence, Ford consistently exposed U.S. operations abroad. We know he gave detailed accounts of the coup against Haiti's President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, but his focus often turned to the militarization of Africa through AFRICOM.
AFRICOM, the United States Africa Command, is the military structure responsible for all U.S. military relations and operations on the African continent.
And Ford highlighted that while AFRICOM's existence is largely unknown to the American public, its presence is pervasive.
And highly militarized. By 2017, AFRICOM was conducting 3,500 operations per year on the continent.
3,500 operations a year, that's nearly 10 missions a day. What does that kind of deep penetration look like on the ground?
It looks like a massive, decentralized military footprint, despite claims of a light footprint. This includes drone bases, logistical hubs, and training facilities in dozens of African nations, all operating under the umbrella of counterterrorism and security cooperation.
And Ford argued this constant military activity destabilized regions.
And promoted U.S. interests, often at the expense of local populations, directly enabling conflict.
And the sources link this U.S. imperial strategy directly to the horrific Congo genocide.
They argue that the 1996 invasion of the Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC, by U.S. allies Uganda and Rwanda triggered a conflict that has resulted in 6 million Congolese deaths since 1996.
6 million, ranking it as the largest genocide since WWII.
It is, and the sources detail the clear economic incentive. The relative prosperity of the minority Tutsi political and business elite in Rwanda is, according to UN reports cited by Ford, directly built on the systematic looting of coltan, gold, and other mineral resources from the DRC.
That economic fact is staggering.
It's the economic underpinning of the crime. For example, Uganda's gold exports increased an astounding 50-fold between 1994 and 2000.
Despite the fact that Uganda previously produced no diamonds or significant gold deposits itself.
Exactly. This increase was entirely due to resources being looted from the conflict zone in the DRC and laundered through allied nations, with the U.S. providing crucial diplomatic and logistical cover.
This leads us to the implication of key U.S. figures, specifically Susan Rice. How is she implicated in suppressing information and protecting Washington's clients who committed these atrocities?
Susan Rice is identified as a key political figure in enabling this genocide by providing political protection to Washington's clients, Rwanda's Paul Kagame and Uganda's Yoweri Museveni.
How did she do that?
Ford details her direct involvement in delaying UN reports that meticulously documented human rights violations and mass killings reports that specifically charged Rwandan troops with engaging in acts that might be classified as crimes of genocide.
So she actively suppressed that information.
Suppressed and delayed. Furthermore, Rice actively blocked the UN Security Council from demanding that Rwanda cease supporting the M23 rebels in Congo. The authors argue she fought a two-front battle to ensure Washington's murderous allies remained politically untouchable.
Shifting to North Africa, Ford also documented how the 2011 NATO war on Libya exposed deep, endemic anti-black racism in the Maghreb.
Yes, which manifested immediately against black people, regardless of their nationality. The NATO intervention, which was often framed as a humanitarian effort to stop Gaddafi,
inadvertently or intentionally fueled a horrifying wave of racist violence.
Exactly. This violence was directed against both non-Libyan Africans who were working in the country and dark-skinned Libyans.
What were some of the specific examples?
Specific examples cited include reports from Turkish oil workers describing Chaldeans being massacred with pruning shears and axes by opposition forces. There were widespread reports of African men being paraded on car hoods after being captured.
And the most painful aspect was the deployment of racist language.
Yes. The use of the term Abd Arabic, for slave or servant, was widely deployed against black individuals with the same deep contempt and historical weight as the word nigger in the U.S.
And this racial animus was a core component of the rebel mobilization.
A central component.
And that leads to the ultimate irony of the entire intervention, which Ford highlighted so powerfully.
The irony is it's stark. The principal call to arms used by the rebels to justify their violence and garner Western support was the fabricated false specter of black mercenaries supporting Gaddafi.
A completely false narrative.
Completely false. Yet, once NATO achieved victory, the new regime immediately ushered in a real influx of white Euro-American mercenaries and capitalists,
who rushed into the country for what was openly called a gold rush to exploit Libya's resources.
Ford notes that in the new Libya, white and money made right. It perfectly illustrates the racist imperial core of the intervention, which had ironically claimed humanitarian motives.
This deep structural critique culminates in the modern crises, connecting racial capitalism to recent events. The author's analysis of the COVID-19 pandemic is particularly damning, labeling the resulting carnage mass murder by corporate duopoly.
The pandemic didn't create the disparities. It exposed them in the most painful way possible. Let's look at the data points the sources emphasized. The coronavirus death rate for African Americans was 2.6 to 3.5 times higher than that of whites.
And despite being only 13% of the population,
Blacks suffered a collective 27% of all COVID-19 deaths nationwide.
That carnage, they argue, was not an unfortunate side effect of a novel virus, but a predictable outcome of the system. In Ford's words, it was pre-programmed.
Pre-programmed by racial capitalism.
Yeah.
The duopoly system, through decades of facilitating the race to the bottom, this constant push for austerity, deliberately lowered working-class living standards and slashed social service supports.
And a crucial data point here is the elimination of over 500,000 hospital beds across the U.S. since 1975.
That reduction in healthcare capacity directly contributed to the inability of the system to cope with the surge of the virus, particularly in concentrated, historically underserved Black urban centers.
Right.
The COVID-19 crisis exposed the complete moral failure of capitalist healthcare. Ford placed culpability on every Democrat who used their power to prevent the establishment of a universal healthcare system.
And because the Black political class was tasked with managing these underdefended Black population centers without challenging the austerity agenda.
The authors deemed them co-conspirators in the resulting mass casualties.
This systemic failure inevitably led to massive resistance, exemplified by the #Black Lives Matter movement, rooted in opposition to state violence and mass incarceration. But even here, the authors issue a powerful caution regarding the danger of co-optation.
The critique is aimed at tactical failure, the tactic of disrupting candidates unless it is consistently backed by radical, non-negotiable demands that challenge the system itself.
It inevitably leads to co-optation.
Right. The duopoly simply absorbs the energy and nudges the movement towards incremental, ineffective reform. The primary risk, they warned, was that without transformative demands, #BLM would become just another brand of Democrat.
The sources highlight a specific incident from 2015 involving Hillary Clinton as a defining moment in this co-optation process.
They called it a self-humiliation. When #BLM activists confronted Hillary Clinton in 2015, and she solicited concrete demands from them.
They failed to present any.
They failed to present any specific, movement-defining political or legislative demands. Instead, they asked her for reflection and how she felt about their concerns.
And Clinton, a veteran politician, successfully lectured them on the necessity of having a clear plan like the civil rights movement had with specific voting or housing legislation.
It allowed her to seize the political high ground. And the organization later found itself circling what the authors call the Democratic Party black hole. The DNC later issued an endorsement praising the movement, which forced co-founder Alicia Garza to issue a clarifying statement that this didn't imply affiliation. Yet the leadership was still pushing for DNC-sanctioned candidate forums,
demonstrating the irresistible gravitational pull of the Democratic Party.
and the necessity of resisting it with explicit, radical demands.
So if incremental reform and co-opted movements are inadequate, the authors advocate for embracing truly transformative, civilization-building demands. What is the central non-negotiable demand they propose for a new, authentic left movement?
The central transformative demand is the nationalization of the banks and placing them under public control to serve public purposes.
Nationalizing the banks.
Yes. Ford noted that the hatred of the banks, the institutions that caused the 2008 crisis and continue to fuel inequality, is damn near universal.
Rivaled only by the hatred and fear directed toward Black people and Muslims, according to the book.
And this universal disdain makes bank nationalization a uniquely popular bridging demand. He dismissed calls to turn monster banks into mere cooperatives as silly, arguing that institutions built for oppression must be permanently dismantled and their power transferred to the public.
And why is this specific demand, nationalizing the instruments of capital, so essential for Black America and crucial for achieving Black Latino solidarity?
Because it targets the foundational engine of racial capitalism in urban centers. Bankers and realtors were the forces that engineered the ghettos through redlining and predatory lending.
And they're the core engines of modern gentrification and Negro removal.
Exactly. Black and Latino communities share the exact same common opposition: the banking system.
So nationalization would be a self-determinationist aspect of national redevelopment.
It would dismantle the power structure responsible for ethnic cleansing and land asset inflation, fostering true unity around a shared transformative economic objective. So we have thoroughly explored Glenn Ford and Margaret Kimberley's core argument that U.S. politics and history are fundamentally defined by a criminal enterprise of racial capitalism.
A structure upheld by a political duopoly.
The Republicans and Democrats, yes, and actively managed by a compliant Black misleadership class.
And the historical crimes, like the real story of the Mystic Massacre and the Thanksgiving myth,
continue to inform modern policies of Negro removal, whether enacted through the speed of disaster like Katrina or the slow, calculated pace of gentrification in Detroit. Their work really demands that we look beyond service-level politics and commit to understanding and challenging these structural truths.
Given the author's meticulous exposure of the corporate duopoly's failure, most recently during the horrific COVID-19 crisis, we are left with a critical question based on their perspective. Is the true path forward to reject incremental reform entirely? And if so, does that necessitate focusing exclusively on singular, transformative demands, like the total nationalization of the instruments of capital? Ford and Kimberly believe the Black radical tradition is not just about survival, but about building a better society, a civilization-building tradition rooted in justice. The final thought they leave us with is, what uncompromising truths and challenging demands must we embrace today to truly activate that justice-oriented civilization-building tradition? We hope you enjoyed this exploration of the Black Agenda. We encourage you to subscribe to the mini book podcast African American Books Edition and tell others about this program. Please also suggest in the comments books that you would like to hear covered in future episodes. Then, thank you for subscribing and listening.